Thank you for joining our audio recording of Maine State Apiarist Tony Jadzcak. He did a talk at the Cumberland County Beekeepers Association meeting on March 4th, 2014. The subject matter of the talk is spring management. It's a walk through beekeeping from early March through mid-May, early May, whenever the dandelion bloom is in your area. It's an audio presentation of what to be looking for as you inspect your bees and what to be doing depending on what you're finding during those inspections. It was an audio recording, so what we have done is, where possible, we have tried to insert some of the slides that were being referenced at the time that he was speaking about them in the live presentation. Thank you for joining us. Maine State Apiarist Tony Jadzcak.
I usually don't get around to looking at my bees till mid-March, usually around the 17th. Usually my drop-dead day is to start looking St. Patrick's Day, just to pick a day. In light of the fact that I'm here tonight, and people have been emailing me and sending me pictures and questions, I decided Saturday I'd take a look to see what I saw on my own stuff, since I know what I do to my own stuff. But in general, and I hate to be general about this, despite the freezing cold weather we're having, which is not like it used to be in my mind back in the 80s and 90s, but it's cold, prolonged cold snaps, from what I'm seeing personally, and in my travels with people running anywhere from, like, say, 50 to 300-400 hives, the bees look fantastic, which is kind of amazing in that, again, in general, they're very heavy. They haven't consumed nearly as much honey as they had this time last year. And part of it is because they've been so inactive in tight cluster, whereas the last winter, and then so 12, 13, and then 9, 10, we had some pretty mild winters. So therefore the bees were more active. Therefore they were snooping around, flying around on decent days, consuming more honey, rearing more brood. So my guess is, I didn't really dig and pull frames. I did go to 3 yards, dragged between 80 and 100 pounds of candy, just in case, God forbid, they needed candy. Very long distances. I think I put in miles. I started spring training Saturday, so I've only got 22 more pounds to lose, and I'll be there, at least where I was last September. But I opened 60 hives, and it's usually by the yard. First yard, they were beautiful. The snow actually was melted on the pallets. I keep them too high, so I was able to assess the weight on every one of them. Second yard, the snow was like that deep, so therefore I couldn't tip hives, but I was able to take off the cover off of each one. Everybody was good there. There's 20 in the first yard, 20 in the second yard. Third yard, there was 20. I found one, and I'll show you a picture of what I saw, with acute dysentery, opened up the hive, no bees in there. That's indicative of nosema. You see a lot of bee poop in the hive, and few to no bees. They've all flown the coop, literally. And then 3 weak ones, again in the same yard. So what you'll find is what Alex was alluding to. There's a vast difference in location. These yards were only separated by, between the first and second, a mile, and between the second and third, probably 2.5, perhaps 3 miles. So, and it's the same thing during a honey flow in the summer. One yard will be bailing it in. You go up the road 2 miles, bees are sitting still. They're still waiting for whatever it is that makes plants secrete nectar. Because, you drive down the road, it all looks the same. Clover, etc. Yet this yard is making it, yard up the road isn't. So, again, look at those items. I will say 2 of them are bad, and one of them's just, And if you can identify these things, you're good. You're on your way to being an experienced beekeeper. So, I don't know if we'll need any lights dimming. Is Garrett here? Who's Garrett? He's the guy I've been communicating with, and I can't put a face to him. Okay, well, that's why we communicate. So he had asked if I'd review spring management, kind of what you should be looking for, what you should be anticipating, and if there are problems, how to identify them. Many of you have seen some or all of these slides in the past. Really nothing's changed other than I'm on my own now, and my 2 sled dogs who used to pull the sleds of candy have grown up and left the state, although the number 1 there, he's in Vermont. He's going to be getting into bees this year. He's got a baby due, so he needs some extra money. He's in it for the money, not the fun. So, as I said, usually around mid-March. I went a little early this year just because, but you certainly want to make the rounds. And the reason I say mid-March is because theoretically you did your job last fall and you know all the hives were good, ready to go to bed. With my situation, I know who my problem hives or problem children are because I found a great use for this Gorilla duct tape. I'll put a little piece on either the left or right corner of hives that need attention, so when I come back the following spring, I don't have to really consult my notes. I know if it's got gray duct tape, it means one thing. If it's got black, it means another. And fortunately, in those yards, I carried roughly 8 to 9 candy boards, well, actually 8 or 10 to each yard. And out of the 60 hives, I only put out 12 boards. And the reason I put out that many was, snowshoeing pulling 100 pounds is really good exercise if it doesn't kill you. But this one yard was so far out, I decided I'm not going all the way back to the truck, dragging them candy boards 2 ways. So, again, I used more than I really needed. So, as I said earlier, depending upon where your bees are located, you may find this time of the year they're completely melted on the bottom, and you can break the frost and get a good idea by tipping if you have a feel for that. And over time, you should kind of get an idea of when you stand behind a hive and tip it, if it's light, heavy, or somewhere in between. Other yards were like this, with the bottom hive body completely buried, but that's the purpose of the upper auger holes. This picture here are a couple of Tony Bachelor's hives, and it was taken April 4th, about maybe 11, 12 years ago. So you never know. I mean, it could look like that, I don't know, April 15th. I remember a year or 2 ago we had a blizzard like right around then. Talk about communication. I was already in bed last night. The phone's ringing around 10 o'clock. It's a pretty large commercial beekeeper out of Texas. This is our way. And he says, hey, I hear it's cold in Maine. What's going on? I said, it's cold in Maine. And he says, it's just snowed for the 4th time in Texas. I've been going down here for 40 years with my bees. I've never seen anything like it. Upshot was, he's about a week behind, and he's starting to panic. But that's life. So hopefully your bees had the opportunity to have a cleansing flight like a week ago, over the weekend, and then the Thursday prior to during the school break week. We had days in the 40s, depends on where you were in the state. But certainly the good hives went out and went to the bathroom. And after those first cleansing flights, that's when I got a flurry of emails with attached pictures, some of which showed acute dysentery, which may or may not have been nosema. That was the concern of the beekeepers. Probably in the back you can't see this, but some folks are concerned about the color of the bee poop. So here you can see this snow, maybe the people up front can, is just like someone sprayed it yellow or kind of a tan color. That's actually a good sign. That's good, healthy, cleansing flight action. If the bees are confined for a prolonged period, there'll be a lot more of it. It may be a little thicker. You may actually see it on top of the covers. When the excrement starts getting very dark brown or black and actually starts to kind of cake up on the hive, literally it's a millimeter or 2 thick, especially around the upper auger hole or up by the vent hole under an insulating board if you use it, that's not a good sign, especially if there's an offensive odor associated with it. See that yellow? That's a good thing. I like to see that. Over that warm weekend, I had a couple beekeepers stop by because my doors were open to the shop and I was making candy, and they were like, have you gone to check your bees? Have you gone to check your bees? I'm like, When it's a nice cleansing flight day, I stay out of their way unless I know they're buried. Then I'll go out the day before the warm day and dig a trench so they can get out, because there have been years where my hives were completely covered, lids and all. My time's better making candy. But my wife, who has nothing to do with bees, never looked in a beehive in her life, was out snowshoeing, and she said, the snow's all yellow out in the field. I said, this is a good sign. But she didn't see any bees fly. So you don't have to be there to know that they're doing great, as long as you see that. So this time of the year, basically you want to assess weight. If the hive is really frozen or buried to the ground, you pretty much can't unless you know what was going on last fall. But I will say this. If you take off the insulating board and your inner cover is just covered with bees, there's a good chance, well, number one, it's a very strong hive and a boiler. So for insurance purposes, hives that were just covered, I threw a candy board on them, those that I was unable to tip. I started Saturday. It was snowing. It was like 11 degrees the first yard. And literally, a lot of the hives, every square inch of the inner cover was covered with bees. And as the day progressed, the snow stopped. It warmed up. So therefore, in the morning, some of the clusters looked tight like that. Even though it was cold, they were still above the inner cover. And as the day progressed, of course, there were a lot more bees on the cover. So keep that in mind, the time of day you're looking, the temperature. I always pick cold days, which the books say pick a day when it's not windy and 45 or 50, etc. Well, no wind is key. But when I'm feeding bees, especially candy, where I have to take off the inner cover, I like it to be very cold so the bees are tight. That way, I don't need smoke, or if I do, I need very little. And when I put the candy board on, I'm not squashing bees, thereby making the other bees have to lick up the guts of the bees that I've squashed. So keep that in mind. If you're forced to do it on a warm day, a lot of my candy boards went right on top of the inner cover. Strong hives, it doesn't matter. Those bees will come up, they'll clean it up. A lot of what I saw over the weekend, and this is very common, if you use these insulating boards, and there's either the Homosode or the fiber board, as soon as you take off that outer cover, if you see a big wet stain, or if you put your hand on it, it's soaking wet, you know that hive is alive and doing great, and chances are it's rearing brood. 1 out of the 60 hives, and I don't know why, this board was just solid ice, all frosted over, and the edges were all frosted, yet the whole inner cover was covered with bees. In that situation, knowing I'm not going to be back there for 2-3 weeks or more, I took off that literally frozen insulating board and put a candy board on top. If you encounter that, I would suggest you swap out that frozen insulating board or put a bunch of newspaper between the inner cover and outer cover to suck up some of that excess moisture. Because in that one hive, even though they were strong, there was just too much water and it wasn't venting off. I think my outer cover might have been too tight.
Right on top of the inner cover? Put newspaper just right down on top of that?
If this board is soaking wet, yeah. I would. Or unless you have a spare insulating board, then just swap them out.
Yeah, but I mean, if it goes right down on top, that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, try not to crush the bees. They're going to eat a hole right in the middle, and it's just going to get soaking wet. I've talked about wintering, I think, to this group. There's all different ways. Some people just use newspaper under the inner cover and between the inner and outer cover. That's a subject for September. Anyway, you can see here they are. They're drinking that water. So water is necessary, provided it's in the right place. I've seen some situations with dysentery in my travels this winter, which are mostly postmortems, and some of the hives that I saw in early to mid-January that people had asked me to go see were further north, somewhere around like, say, Dexter, Sangerville, up that way. And they had all starved to death, literally with a full deep of honey on them, honey on the walls. In one situation, and these were supposedly Russian bees, jet black, supposedly they're winter bees and smart, 4 solid frames of brood. Therefore, the bees were tight, clustered on that brood. When we had the first cold snap in January, they wouldn't move literally inches. All the other hives I saw up in that area had, on average, 2 frames of brood, and they were capped. So that implies those bees had not shut down. They were laying right through the month of December. Why, I don't know. In one instance, the person was feeding a pollen substitute in fall. That's not good practice in our climate. When you read about people doing fall or winter feeding of pollen substitute, I'm talking October, November, December, they tend to be the commercial beekeepers trying to ramp up their bees so they get paid well in almonds. In our part of the world, you do not want to stimulate brood production in fall. August, early September, great. Not October, November, or December. And one beekeeper actually had pre-made pollen patties on. Not good when you're in the north. Some of your good hives, you'll see, will chew holes right through that insulating board. That's where extra newspaper comes in. A lot of them were like this. If they're feather light, you got to do something right off. So a candy board, either quick and dirty, a hive like that, you could go right above the inner cover, but more often than not, you'd remove the inner cover, put the candy board on, candy down, or in this situation, if you don't have anything right off, you can emergency feed dry sugar. I prefer to put it right on the inner cover. I'm a believer in not cracking the inner cover until it's absolutely necessary. In fact, in the fall, I don't crack it. I always work the hives by splitting them between the hive bodies in the fall of the year. The beauty of wrapping, though, is if you have to crack that inner cover and see what's going on downstairs, you can fold it over to keep the wind from getting in or heat from escaping. So dry sugar's a good quick fix, but it's really not the most ideal way to feed. You could consider getting like a 1-gallon baggie, Ziploc, fill it about halfway with granulated sugar, add some water, just enough to kind of, move it around with your hands, kind of knead it, turn it into a mush, and then put the mush, I don't know what you'd call it, just kind of a slurry of sugar above the inner cover, put some slits in it with a razor blade, either a shim if you need one, or just the insulating cover right on top. That helps the bees a little bit. It's a little better than dry sugar, but not as superior as candy. In this case here, I happen to have a deep of honey. So that's really the way to go. When you've got a boiler, right, rather than think about going back to feed it every 10 to 14 days or giving it more dry sugar, honey's the way to go, as long as it's disease-free. It's part of the purpose of these frames here. And again, this is probably April at this point. I don't worry about wrapping it, but you notice all the other hives are still wrapped. You can also go with fondant. That's one way to go. It's as good as candy. It's a little more expensive, but there's no labor involved. The hardest part when you buy 40-pound blocks of fondant is cutting this stuff. That's where an electric uncapping knife comes in really good. I've used bread knives. They're very difficult. Once you start to cut, they literally, the fondant sticks back together again. It's weird stuff. So if you do cut the fondant, make sure you're kind of rolling it over. And if you don't understand what I'm saying, you'll totally understand when you try to cut fondant with a knife. Really what you need is a good wire, like a cheese cutter, on sticks to pull it through. Hot is better. I played with fondant 2 winters. Cisco is a good place to get it in bulk here in Westbrook. So there's a couple methods of making candy. I have a handouts on one of these tables somewhere. Over there on Spring Management, and there's 3 different candy recipes. These are just tins about 1.5 inches thick. I line them with Crisco, pour some, put some wax paper in there, and then mix up the candy. If you got like a lobster pot, a good mix would be 15 pounds of dry sugar to 3 pints of water. So first you bring the 3 pints of water to a boil, then add your sugar little by little, stirring it so it doesn't scorch or caramelize. And then it's up to you, but most of the older recipes call for like a 1/4 teaspoon of cream of tartar or a dash of, with a small batch like that, cider vinegar. And then I just, follow the recipe, heat it up to a boil. I don't use a thermometer anymore, but most of the recipes call for bringing up to 238 or 240. Take it off the heat, stir. It'll start to congeal again. Then pour it in your forms, whether it be a pie tin, cookie sheet that you can cut the candy to whatever size you want, and that way this is thin enough so it lays between the inner cover and the insulating board. Again, you don't have to pick up that inner cover, exposing the bees or disturbing the bees. The least you disturb your bees, I know this is hard, the better they're going to do. Just by knocking on hives and listening or blowing down the escape hole, you've caused them to ramp up their metabolism. You'll hear them, they buzz, which means now they're metabolizing more sugar or more honey, thereby needing to go to the bathroom more than they did had you left them alone. That's a key thing with wintering bees in the north. You want them to go to the bathroom outside of the hive, not in the hive. Typically, that recipe I gave you with 15 pounds of sugar will make 2, 4, 6, roughly 8. Depends on how deep you fill them. 7 or 8 of these candy boards, which about 2 pounds each. And it'll hold the bees quite a while, especially if you got a light hive. You give them 2 of these candies above the inner cover. They're good for a couple weeks before you have to go back and check again. Sorry. So here you can see some of the emergency sugar that was left and then candy. And eventually I would replace the whole thing with candy. This is what I mean by candy boards. For those of you new at this, essentially it's an inner cover without the escape hole. You can use inner covers if you have spare ones. Just put a piece of Luan dead center over the escape hole, or maybe get a coffee can or some sort of metal can. Put the can over it so when you pour your candy, then you can remove the can, the bees can come up the escape hole and then eat the candy. Or you can literally flip it face down so when the bees look up, they see candy. Depends on the size. I make mine about 1 inch. If you start getting much bigger than that, you'll definitely have a heart attack dragging your sled to the bee yard. The inch ones average about 7 to 8 pounds plus of candy, plus your rim is about 3 pounds, so each board's roughly 10 pounds. One year I went through a whole exercise, tear weight, measuring how much candy, with or without fumagillin. These are the things you do in the north in Maine in the winter. So here's Tony on April 4th of the same year. He had put out a candy board roughly 2 weeks prior. These hives are quite strong, as you can see. And here's a fresh one. So again, this illustrates why I like to work on cold days. Because by replacing these candy boards, we had smoke going, but there's collateral damage. You're crushing bees. So I like it. Like this morning would have been perfect. Not much wind. Just pop them off real quick, put them on. Don't be pulling frames. Now, some of you may encounter this, and this is what I saw, only it was much more pronounced Saturday in the last yard I went to, in one hive only. And that's definitely symptoms of dysentery, which may or may not be caused by nosema. The only way to know if it's nosema is to literally cut the bees or crush their guts and look through a scope. Tedious work, but it gives you a real good idea of what's going on. Here's another case of when I talked about good and bad bee poop. This is an illustration of bad poop. Notice how thick it is. Notice how dark it is. It's brown. Almost, it can get as thick as black. It's almost like tar on the tar paper around the entrance, and it's definitely on the inner cover as well as on the outer cover. Not a good sign, but oftentimes bees will recover from this. Depends upon the weather. Now, this is a bee that has classic symptoms of nosema. Notice how bloated the abdomen is, and this bee, in fact, if you were to kind of warm her up and give her a lift, she would hit the deck. They're unable to fly, and in fact, they're so fat they're unable to sting because they've lost their sting reflex. And I don't know. Nosema is a problem. It seems like it's worse than ever. However, I was corresponding with the USDA last week, and what I've noticed this year and last year, the nosema loads amongst commercial operations are much lower than they were in 07, 8, 9, and 10. Things started changing around 11. I'm not sure if it's because the beekeepers are using either fumagillin or thymol. I have a suspicion that a lot of the highly susceptible lines of bees to nosema have died off. There is definitely a genetic component to nosema resistance. And Some operations are starting to look for that. And in fact, I think the Bee Informed Partnership is actually looking at nosema loads and mite loads. So they're starting to focus more on parasites and pathogens rather than other issues. So the nosema lives in the gut of the bee, shortens the bee's life, gives them diarrhea, and also atrophies the hypopharyngeal glands up in the head, which the bees use to make bee milk, which is fed to the larvae. To complicate matters, I was reading a paper recently, and I don't know where it's from, but they're finding nosema is actually contracted by the larval stage of bees. Because if the nurse bee has a nosema and she feeds, which she does, the larvae can become infected. This is relatively new stuff. When I was in school and up until a year or two ago, nosema was a disease of adult bees. So the thing has changed. And if you've been keeping track of what's been going on globally, we actually have a new strain of nosema, or a newer strain that was introduced somewhere in the mid-'80s, right around when the varroa mite was introduced, Nosema ceranae, which comes from Apis ceranae, which is where the varroa mite comes from, the Asian honeybee. So a big problem the bee industry, or the bees, are facing these days are parasites and pathogens are jumping species, thereby causing havoc because there's no equilibrium or natural resistance mechanisms. It's kind of a slow downward spiral. Here is a hive with classic nosema symptoms. The bees kind of are all bloated. They got a greasy look to them. And again, that really heavy, dark fecal spotting. Now, if this were, say, mid to late April, that hive might come out of it if it were medicated. This time of the year, a hive like that, depending upon the spore load, chances are it's not going to make it. Back in 2008, I did some extensive work with literally 100 and something hives that we kept sampling over and over again. And we had hives that looked like that with spore counts running around 50 million spores per bee in March. They never saw April 1st. Now, this here is a little different. It's good old dysentery. And in fact, some of the folks who sent me emails with pictures followed up by sending me bee samples. And what I found interesting was some of the hives that looked like that in the picture, and the snow was all black and piles of dead bees in the snow, had very low nosema counts. 100, 200,000 spores per bee. A couple just cracked the 1 million threshold, which is considered to be the treatment threshold. In this situation, I know what happened, and in some of those that I've addressed last week, the beekeepers somehow got confused and were feeding their bees 1-to-1 sugar syrup in the fall. So they had commenced feeding sugar syrup in late September, fed right through October into November. Bad, right? Number one, you want to feed heavy sugar syrup in the fall, 2 sugar to 1 water, more like honey, and try to be done by October 15th so the bees have an opportunity to evaporate off excess moisture. It's called ripening the honey, because excess moisture in the hive can be the death sentence. It's evaporating, some of it's fermenting, and if it's condensing on the inner cover, especially if there's no insulating board, whether it be fiberboard or styrofoam, the bees are forced to drink those water drops. When they're drinking the water, it makes them need to go to the bathroom more, and when we get in cold snaps, like we've had this winter, things go bad and they have to go in the hive. Then the other bees start cleaning it up with their mouth parts, because they're clean animals, spreading the dysentery. I have seen a few samples over the years with amoebas in the bees' intestines. And I know that even before I see them, as soon as I crush the bees, it's a horrible smell in the vial that I'm processing the bees. It's very much like a septic tank. Whereas when I'm just crushing regular bees, they smell like bees or pollen. Now here's a shot of abnormal behavior. And if you see this on a day like today, certainly like early this morning, but you often see this on a sunny day. All the other hives will be nice and tight. There might be a few scattered bees in the snow, but these are out there roosting on the sunny side of the hive. And if you're to take off the covers and look inside, this is what you got. Fistful of bees on the sunny side of the hive where it's warm. And I encountered some of that last Friday on the coast with the people I was working with. This here is classic tracheomite symptoms. Another tip-off will be a lot of dysentery associated with it. You can see all the dysentery, fecal streaking, failure to cluster in cold weather. And what you'll find is piles of bees out front, and all these frames are solid with honey. So if you encounter that sort of behavior on a freezing cold sunny day, I'm talking 20 degrees or less, chances are it's tracheal. Now, if you see a small cluster like this and a frame of brood like one of those that is on the table, especially if you dig deep and see that in the lower hive body, meaning that's what went on last fall, right, because the bees are moving up through winter, that's more indicative of acute varroa and viral infection in the fall entering the winter. The bees going into winter have to be fat and fuzzy and healthy. They've got to make it 4 to 6 months, whereas the summer bees are only going to make it 4 to 6 weeks if they're lucky. So just tracheomite, people say they're all gone. I still see them. Not as much as we used to back in the 80s and through the 90s and early 2000s, but they're still there. Most of my worst samples come from the Canadian border in far northern Aroostook. But the tracheomites live in these breathing tubes. They crawl through the spiracle under this is a wing, and then they basically feed through these spiracles by puncturing them and sucking the blood that's circulating in the bee. There's probably a viral component to tracheomite. I remember back in the 80s we used to have discussions, but we had no way of really identifying viruses back then. There was no RNA or DNA sequencing. So here's what they do. They kind of plug up the tracheal tubes. These are the adults. These are the eggs. And this is what I really see when I'm looking in my lab. So I see silhouettes of the mites and a lot of spotting, fecal spotting, and just shed skins, etc. So, moving along. By mid-March, and again, some people have already started feeding pollen substitute. I'm waiting because I don't like to commence feeding pollen substitute until roughly 1 month prior, or basically one brood cycle prior to natural pollen coming in. If you start stimulating bees to rear brood too early in the season, a couple things can happen. One, the bees, again, have to kick up their metabolism. So they're going to raise more brood. If we get into periods of cold weather, the bees will choose to cluster on the brood rather than move a couple inches to honey. The other thing is, if you stimulate them too soon, you're actually burning the bees out. And there have been studies on this as to how far you can push a bee basically out of cycle, feeding them an artificial diet until they collapse. And you might go 3 brood cycles, but it's not recommended. Your bees are pretty healthy if you go 1 brood cycle. Then by, say, mid-April, especially down this part of the state, the bees will have more frequent opportunity to visit things such as alder, poplar will be the first ones. Then they'll get into the willows, maples, oaks, etc. So something to keep in mind. You can add your protein to the candy board as it's congealing. You can buy it pre-made, or you can mix it up yourself. I've tried them all. Some hives just wolf them down. Some hives won't touch them. They turn to concrete. I can honestly say the bees seem to consume the Mega Bee a lot better than the Bee Pro. I've been playing around with Ultra Bee. I don't know. They put lemongrass in there that supposedly makes the bees eat it quicker. The benchmark is the Beltsville bee diet, which is still on the market, but it's used to rear bumblebees, of all things. So as you can see, some of them eat it right up. Now, this hive is nothing to brag about right here. Number one, it's off to the side, and probably if it was, this isn't my hive, I would center it and make sure I have honey on either side of the cluster, because bees can get in trouble if they get stuck on the walls, especially if the honey's over here, and stimulating brood production by feeding protein can actually make the matters worse, because as soon as you stimulate brood production, honey consumption ramps right up. And a few years ago, I wrote an article for the Bee Line about honey consumption, and essentially, say, end of November, December, January, hives are only eating like a pound or two a week, if that. But right now we're getting into the period where hives are going to start consuming more honey almost at an exponential level. So by the time April hits, those hives that were consuming roughly 2 pounds of honey a week are going to be consuming 7 pounds of honey a week. More brood production, more brood hatching, more mouths to feed, both adult and immature. So now we're moving on to, I would say this is probably, depending upon the year, mid to late March. And there's always about a week window where my bees cause trouble. And I don't keep bees in urban or suburban areas, but I keep them out on farms. So if there's logging operations going on prior to natural pollen being available, but the bees are able to fly, but more likely there's a silage pile on the other side of that barn there, my bees are just pounding the sawdust or the silage. And it's almost like clockwork. I get several calls every March when we have that good weather before the first, usually it's the willows and alders start putting out pollen. And the bees are just tumbling around in the silage or in this sawdust. They love sawdust. And in this case, the logging operation just quit. Not one person was stung, but these guys were a bunch of babies. You know, a couple of bees flying around, and that's it. We quit. I mentioned livestock. So if you're in a situation where you've got neighbors who have livestock, or there's a logging operation going on close by, or your neighbors are into feeding birds, because the bees love to go to bird feeders for that dust. Some of the bird seed is actually treated with molasses or sugar, but they'll go for little seeds, like millet seeds, and just they kind of tumble around in that dust. Again, they're not stinging, but if you're not a beekeeper and you see all these bees in the bird feeder basically deterring the birds, it doesn't make for good, PR. So in the yards that I have troubles with, because it's only about a week window, I got a bunch of old buckets that I'll cut a smile in, and I hang them in trees. And for perspective, see how far they are from the hives. So essentially, I'm setting them up maybe from here to those tables that are upright, back there, or maybe by the clock on the wall. I want my bees to fly out there so they're not getting in each other's way. If I'm trying to entice the bees off of the silage or the sawdust, I'll actually take a handful of this stuff and I'll go down the line and I put a little bit on the bottom boards and push some inside of the auger holes of every hive. Now they've got the smell, and when they crawl out of the hive, they're going to have the protein on their body, so they're going to key on that new smell. Plus, it's a better protein source than the sawdust, which is nothing. It's cellulose, or the silage. I think they're going to the silage because they'll often add molasses. There's like fermentation going on there.
So what's in there?
This is pollen substitute dry. In this case, it was Bee Pro. Again, I've tried them all. I don't like to put the Mega Bee in there because it's more money. I'd rather put that in a patty. But here you can see the bees are just having a grand time. They'll tumble around in there. They'll get it all over their bodies. If it's a little cold, they kind of regroup, and they'll actually pack it in their pollen baskets and back to the hive. And they'll take, I usually give them about 4 coffee cans. I don't like to put too much in there. I tip the bucket forward a little bit so the rain won't go in and get it all wet. And roughly 4, well, they're not even a pound coffee anymore, whatever they are these days. I use about 4 of them and line the bottom of this, never exceeding the height of that bottom rim. So it will definitely get your bees out of your neighbor's hair if you do this. And again, it's usually about a week. This is one we're getting there. So as soon as you see the alder, catkins, they're one of the first ones, poplar and quaking aspens, spring is coming. And in fact, there have been years where I've seen the poplars blooming like this, standing in 3 feet of snow with the bees working the trees. As long as that temperature is up there. And I would say high 40s. Again, all the books talk about mid-50s, 57 degrees, not for northern wintered bees. And I just got into this with some pesticide people because they're giving recommendations of when to spray, by basically textbook numbers. And I said, you really got to pay attention to where you are in the country. Our bees were flying, a week ago, I don't think it hit 45 up my way. It was probably 40, 41, 42. Again, it depends upon how much brood is in the hive as to what temperature they're going to fly at. So I've been talking candy, dry feed, or that slushies, those sugar slushies, up until this point. Once the bees have more frequent opportunities to fly, such as when you see the alders, certainly the poplars and willows, then you can start feeding a sugar syrup. And you can go either 1-to-1, again, spring, more nectar-like, or 1.5-to-1, which is a little thicker, more BTUs, or more calories in there. That's how I look at it. So if you've done emergency feeding late March or early to mid-March with sugar, you can now put your syrup right on top. Either if you're a glutton for punishment, you're going to do it by the quart and go there every day, or you can do it 2 gallons at a time. Again, I got this day job like most of you, but I try to give them stuff that's going to at least last them a week until I can get back to them again. And here you can see they can be fed, again, while they're still wrapped. Keep those old rotted hive bodies out in the bee yards or under storage and use that as a shell. Remember, if you're adding antibiotics such as fumagillin, it's light sensitive and it'll break down rapidly, like within hours. Plus, those Boardman feeders, right, spring of the year, to stick in there, they're worthless. The cluster is here, right? They started down here in the fall for your new beekeepers. They've worked their way up for the winter, so that food is right above them. That's where you put the candy board up. They look up, there it is. That's where all the heat is. Then you're going to have the red maples. I always feel good when I see the red maples because I know probably not going to get any more snow. And that's kind of one of the first real big pushes for the bees. Their bees are working both nectar and pollen on the red maple. And then certainly this one, you know we're out of the woods when the sugar maples bloom. So right about this time, if I've got my act together in a good year and I'm not on crutches, I start unwrapping. Last year it was disaster, and I didn't get unwrapped till sometime in the middle of May, and that I was laid up. So start thinking about unwrapping at this point. Certainly the grass will be greening up. You might see a few dandelions popping along foundations of buildings. So again, I'm not giving you exact dates, but these are the plants you want to look for. In general, dandelions up my way, which is the Waterville towards Skowhegan, anywhere from May 16th to 20th. Down here, it's probably more like, depending upon the year, May 6th to 10th. Some years, it's actually earlier. End of April, I've seen it in those warm winters we've had. So now's the time to unwrap. Reverse if necessary. What you often find is if you have waited, like I do in many years for whatever reason, and come unwrapping time, if those bees have pushed the queen down and now your brood pattern is occupying 2 deeps, do not reverse. Because think what you've done. You've got a cluster between 2 hive bodies, and then you'll split them. So as a rule, don't split the brood. They want to keep it 92 degrees. Work with the bees, not against them. And I see that's one of the major flaws with some inexperienced beekeepers with the screen bottom board. They'll reverse too early, they'll pull the tray, and then the bees, the brood down here, will either get chilled or the bees will abandon it and move up where the heat is, right under the inner cover. This was a good hive. You notice when you split them at unwrapping time and there's bare comb and they're raising drones between the hive bodies, you know that's a good hive, and you know that hive is going to be a candidate for one that swarms toward the middle or latter part of the dandelion bloom. So get into just your quick first inspections in the spring. I'm pretty good on time, I think. So here you can see an early inspection. Now, this is the time of year when you want to pick a day when there's minimal wind and temperatures are hopefully in the 50s, if not a little better, because you don't want to chill brood, and you want to be real quick when you're looking at the brood. So essentially, pull a frame of honey on the wall, leave that out of the hive, shake the bees back in, and then look at your brood, put it back in the box, and kind of shuffle the frames over. Quick examination. What we see here is an excellent brood pattern, nice tight pupal caps, very few skips. The thing that's kind of alarming is how little honey is up in the corners of the frame. So again, if you're running into hives like this, very broody, high populations of bees, once you commence feeding sugar syrup, do not stop until that dandelion flow hits. Because during the maple bloom, in that time of the year, we often have high winds, lots of rain, just crummy, foggy, lousy weather. So out of a week, even though all these things are blooming, the bees might only get a few hours on 1 or 2 days. Depends on where you live and what your local climate is. And you wouldn't believe how different they are in just short distances within this state, from coast to inland or south to north. So you want to just basically check the brood pattern. You don't have to see the queen. Make sure you see some larvae, basically all the stages, button them up. Look for any abnormalities. So again, beautiful frame. Scary light, though. Just a little nectar up in the corners, little capped honey. Now, if you run into a frame like that, you know you've got problems. That's a queen issue, right? Lots of drone pupal caps in worker-sized cells. So at this stage of the game, depending upon if there's a good critical mass of bees, you can either try to salvage the hive, but first determine, is it a laying worker or is it a bad queen? And that way you'll take appropriate actions. More often than not, when I run into hives that are weak, well, at unwrapping time, if they got a queen issue, it's called dead in my book, even if there's 4 frames of bees. Because without my intervention, by introducing a new queen or new brood, it would eventually fizzle out. So laying workers, as you know, multiple eggs, multiple larvae in the cells. If you see 1 egg in each cell, a nice tight brood pattern of drones in worker-sized cells, then you've got a queen that has failed. So you'd have to hunt her down, kill her, and in a day or so, reintroduce another queen, ideally with a couple frames of open brood and perhaps a frame of capped brood, or 1 open brood, meaning larvae, 1 capped, because the brood's giving off pheromones. So that's going to cause the worker's ovaries to atrophy, in addition to that introduced queen giving off pheromones. So adding brood aids in queen acceptance. This is very common. Usually in April or May, I see this. You look at a hive, it's doing great. Nice, good brood pattern, queen's laying great. And then hives undergo what's called spring dwindle. It's a common phenomenon. You check the hives in March, they're boiling. You check them in April, they're boiling. But then, as the young bees start hatching out, there's a decline in population in the hive because all those bees who hatched out last fall are now at the end of their life. They're getting to be 4, 5, and 6 months old. So don't freak out when you see this. This is natural. But often at that spring dwindle time, hives will go into a supersedure mode. So if you see frames of flat cap brood, meaning a queen right hive, and you see emergency supersedure cells, slide that frame back in there, leave them alone for a couple weeks at least. Especially in early May, there should be a few mature drones in the area. There certainly will be mature drones from packages or nukes that have come up from the south and been sprinkled around all the counties in Maine. Look for any abnormal cappings. This is where my job, the bee inspector's got to do the disease bit, right? Look for sunken, greasy pupal caps. Always have some toothpicks or a nail in your pocket. Probe, see what's cooking underneath. If you see mottled brood patterns, especially with the prepupae or the pupal stage melting down, flat, black, and shiny, get a toothpick, check them out. Foul brood was pretty good it was very good last year. I believe it was a little less than 1%. I think that's the best in the 30-plus years I've been checking. Way, way back in the 80s, it was like 15, 17% of the hives I opened. So little by little, we're cleaning up the old junk in the barns, and beekeepers are more skilled and just doing a better job of keeping this disease down. So again, the old roping out test, look for pinholes. More often than not, when you see a pinhole in the spring of the year, and if you peel back that pupal cap, you're going to find a chalk brood mummy or perhaps sac brood. Sac brood's kind of going up, though, over time. On your first inspection, meaning when you get out there in another week or 2 or 3, and you run into dead hives, definitely do a post-mortem. Figure out what killed it for a couple reasons. One, if it's foul brood, like we just saw, it's going to be spread throughout the bee yard or within the area as hives come and rob any remaining honey out of that hive because there's no flowers blooming, right? Alternatively, if it didn't die of disease, you want to plug that hive up so it doesn't get robbed out, so you got extra frames or boxes of honey to feed to your hives that are boiling with bees and getting light on stores. So it's two reasons. So if you look in a couple weeks, you see a dead hive, you don't have time to start pulling frames, just carry the duct tape or something, plug up the entrances, auger holes. I usually put something right on top of the escape hole of the inner cover. Typically, I'll rip off some tar paper and put that on top so no bees can get up and get in. Again, I'm trying to keep other bees, because it's always the good ones that steal the honey who don't really need it, and the ones that really need those frames of honey are sitting home shivering, trying to keep their brood warm. So post-mortem on this one, it's classic symptoms of foul brood. Again, scattered pattern, sunken pinholes, greasy. At this stage of the game, there's no roping out because it died over the winter. There will only be scale. Flat black and shiny. If you try to pull the scale out with a toothpick, it adheres tight to the cell wall. That's why there's one toothpick in each one of them frames. Just try not to dig too many. You've got a couple more bee schools to go. And I'm not saying they're all foul either. In spring of the year, you might see European. Healthy brood is pearly white, plump and juicy. When it starts getting off color, and especially if it smells like dead fish, pull one out, take a whiff. Smells like fish, it's European. If it has really no odor, chances are it's viral, or it could be chilled. So this is more with European classic symptoms. Starts out with a yellow dot in the gut of the bee, and then it just progresses. The difference between the American and European is the scale comes out very easily with a toothpick, and it's always twisted. Even if there's a pupal cap on that European foul brood infected larvae, she's beginning to pupate, there'll be a slight twist to her. I mentioned sac brood. You may see sac brood on your first brood inspections. I'm seeing that in around 4% of the hives these days. I think a lot of it has to do with varroa. Back pre-varroa and early varroa stages, I was only seeing in 0.25%. So it's quite common these days. I see it typically in the spring, or more often than not, after a hive is split or after you make a nuke out of a hive. The nuke, due to chilling, or the chilling of the brood, the viruses are more prone to infect the brood. Chilling is a major factor with all the viruses that we're dealing with, especially some of the ones with adult bees. Chalk brood I mentioned, chances are you'll see the mummies on the bottom board first, but if you peel back any of those pinholes and you see a mummified pupae, it's chalk brood. Nothing to lose sleep about unless every cell is infected with chalk brood, then you might consider requeening. This critter right here, you definitely have to look for and deal with. So at unwrapping time, if there is kept drone pupae, look for patches in the pink or purple-eye stage. Try to look at 50 if you can. If you're finding them, again, in 5, or if you find a pupae, peel it out, a mite. Next one, a mite. Next one, a mite. I pretty much stop looking if I'm 3 for 3. But if you want to keep going, if you approach or hit 10% or greater, I strongly urge you to control varroa. In the spring of the year, really your options are limited. The thymol products won't do a great job, say, in April, early May. However, the Hop Guard will do a pretty good job. Does a great job when there's no brood. But just remember this. Don't put Hop Guard strips into hives that are in tight cluster. If we were to put strips into hives today, or even yesterday for that matter, there would be mortality of bees. We would see probably a cup to maybe a pint of bees. And we found this out 2 falls ago. So, and the company is aware of this now because they've also seen the same thing happen in Germany. The good news about the Hop Guard strips is they're being reformulated. So the new strips that are going to come on the market shortly, I'm told, but I've learned not to hold my breath, are going to last for 2 weeks rather than 4 to 5 days. So therefore, again, the object of the game is to treat for a whole brood cycle because none of the materials are really penetrating the pupal caps. We'll only have to use 2 applications, roughly at 2-week intervals, whereas now we have to do 3 and try to space them to cover a brood cycle. The other option that would have minimal impact on the bees, again, so hop guard, if the bees are loose, the cluster's loose, and the bees are flying. We don't want them in tight cluster with nights. Like if the nights are getting into the 20s, low 20s and teens, it's still too cold. Because while that strip is initially wet, there's going to be mortality. The Apivar, which is the Amatraz strip, we used in very cold weather last, I guess it was October up in Aroostook, and it was, in the teens when it was applied. We saw no adult mortality, and that one would have minimum impact on your hive building up. I guess from there, I wouldn't use formic acid too soon in the year, plus formic is very tough on old bees coming out of winter. So you'll have a significant spring dwindle if you put formic quick strips in there. Again, hard on old bees. Probably my third choice would be the Apolite Var. And I would, again, that is the thymol wafer that you place around the periphery of the cluster. I wouldn't go with the Apivar early in the year because it might not do the trick. Plus, it's going to work against your bees. As they're trying to expand and move up, you're going to have that thymol, which is usually dead center over the cluster. If you read the labels, it's going to make your bees either shift or go around it. So read the labels. Temperature is key with a lot of the organic materials.
Tony, what was choice number 2?
The Apivar, which is a synthetic. That's Amatraz. I haven't used that one yet in my operation. I hope not to, but someday it's good to have in reserve. Just remember, again, part of the deal with these materials, pull the strips out of the hives when it's through the treatment period. The big problems we had with the Apistan strips and the checkmate strips was a lot of beekeepers failed to pull the strips out after treatment and just would add more strips in the next time they treated. And when you're giving bees a low dose, or the mites a low dose, you're selecting for mites with resistance to the chemical.
Tony, can you just clarify? I think you said Apivar when you meant to say Apigard.
My second choice would be Apivar, the synthetic. Apigard, right. I wouldn't use the gel, the thymol gel, too early in the spring. Probably because, number one, it's probably not going to do a good job, but it's going to work against your bees. So it's not legal. But oxalic, the time to use is late fall when the bees are broodless, one treatment. And, the Canadians, they're using it all over the world, not here yet, at least legally. In the spring, oxalic isn't really that great because it's not going to kill the mites in the brood. The only thing that comes fairly close, well, how many oxalic dribbles are you going to give them? How many times are you going to hit them with oxalic in the spring? It's not good. It's detrimental to the bees. The time to use oxalic is late fall, when they're broodless, as a cleanup, because all the mites are on the bees. There has been work done, a lot of the work was actually out of Iran, where repeated use of oxalic acid, again, it's a toxin, interferes with the bees' their equivalents of kidneys. They're Malpighian tubes, which are like a mammalian kidney. I've had commercial guys try to use oxalic during say, before crop pollination and during crop pollination. They're not knocking the mites down. There they are. So again, you can sample. My experience early in the spring is often if I do a alcohol wash or sample the adult bees, I'll get a negative, whereas if I start picking through brood, especially the drone brood, I'll find mites in the drone brood. So in the spring of the year, I would suggest you look in the drone brood. Later on in the year, look at the adult bees via either a sugar roll, alcohol wash, or bottom board detector. I got some threshold numbers if you want to talk about. If you have deadouts and you see bees such as these or bees with normal-looking wings but very stunted or short abdomens, that's indicative of a varroa mite infestation and virus the previous fall. So again, pull out some of that dead brood if you encounter any deadouts. I think I'm getting there. When you see this, you know you're home free, or the bees are anyway, unless it rains for the whole dandelion bloom and the rest of the summer, like almost happened last year, and then they starve anyway. But typically, when you see this, it's time to manage for swarming. And that, I think, is a topic for another discussion, but you can make nukes, make splits, all sorts of things. Try to keep them out of the trees. So don't despair. I can guarantee you, by May 16th, there will be dandelions. And I got word on high yesterday from a manager of one of the big blueberry companies. I said to him, because we do this to each other every winter, when's the blueberries going to bloom? Because the commercial guys are already calling. When's it going to happen? And he says it's going to be really early this year. That's what I said. But he's been laid up all winter because he's had surgery, and he just keeps looking out the window, and he said he saw a flock of robins. Well, I saw a flock of robins last week, too. So I don't know what's wrong with the robins, but if they're any indication of what's to come, we've got to be hopeful. It's probably warmer here than Texas for sure. Yeah, they're in Washington County and up my way, like around Waterville. Yeah, them and the snowy owls. All right. So I can guarantee you it's going to be a big year this year. That's what I said last year. Big crop. It's going to be a big crop. And it was until it started raining. So.
Can you talk for 1.5 minutes about what inoculant is for in clover?
Oh. Well, you have to inoculate clover unless you're planting it with existing clover because it has a bacteria associated with it. I said that. Azotobacter agilis. Why I remember that, I don't know. It was pounded into my head in college. But clovers and the legumes are nitrogen fixers.
Right, but the bacteria allows the clover to fix the nitrogen.
And it generates and spreads better.
It doesn't have anything to do with its nectar.
It gets it. Well, I'm told you have to inoculate it.
For the nitrogen fixing. Particularly in poor soil conditions that don't have the bacteria naturally, like in a tilled environment.
The best place to grow the sweet clover is railroad beds. They love that. Gravel pits. Just remember this, if you have livestock, and if you do, you already know this, once sweet clover gets tall and mature, it's actually poisonous. I had a farmer call me a few years ago freaking out because some beekeeper asked him if he could plant clover. Well, he didn't realize it was sweet clover. And he's like, what do I do with this stuff? Because it was too late. Once it gets too big, you can't feed it to animals because it's like Coumadin. It makes them bleed if they cut themselves. So you've got to cut that and either turn it to silage or turn the animals out before it gets tall and blooms. We're not known for much sweet clover here in this state. That's why the guys leave Maine blueberries and head up to the Dakotas. It grows wild all over out there, but there's less and less of it because of corn, soybeans, etc. Some of you may have read the USDA just gave, I think, $3 million for several states in the Midwest to put in bee-friendly pasture, kind of like the CRP program used to do. There's a crop reserve program where farmers were paid to take acreage out of production and plant things such as clovers or alfalfas or just stuff to let the land regenerate so they could till it back under instead of just playing it out by throwing urea at it and, fertilizer year after year. That's a whole nother story. One of the good times I've had success planting clover is right when the snow is almost done and the frost is coming out of the ground and you see it's like cracking up in the hay fields. I use one of them grinder things, and then after a while I get sick of that and I just start throwing it, But that's a good time to plant it. I don't know if they call it frost seeding, might be the term, but it's right when there's just like a bit of frost or just a little bit of snow, and you can see where the ground is cracking and breaking up as the frost is coming out. Or you can till and do it, like a professional. But there's a few people planting sweet clover in this state, but mostly just for fun, just to watch the bees fly in it. I don't know if... Up north we grow a lot of clover too, but that's for potato rotation to fix nitrogen. Yeah, well then there's no flowers. So you're defying the purpose. I plant alsike for the most part on my land. Up north, it's mostly Alsike, Mammoth Red, and Dutch. For some reason, up around Limestone, it's for some reason a lot of Dutch clover up there. I don't know why. But the growers have gone to Mammoth Red, which isn't a great bee plant because there's more green manure, more tonnage to till under. So anyway, look at your bees. You're looking for weight. Do not introduce water into the system, at least during the weather we're having right now, until they have more opportunities to take cleansing flights and go to the bathroom. And if everything goes right, maybe the third, fourth week of March, you can switch them over. Again, it depends how it goes. We've had years when we used to have the annual meeting in the spring, and bees would be bringing in pollen mid-March. I don't know if it's going to happen this year. It could. I mean, all we need is a week of 90, right? Things will turn around real quick.